Our world is lost in unnecessary fear and hurt. Our systems seem scientifically engineered to make you small, powerless, and always waiting for the next great leader who will fix the problems around us. Worse, we're witnessing neighbor versus neighbor while warfare breaks out around our family tables. But you have access to a spirit, a strength that enlarges and empowers you. Even better, you don't need to wait for the next big movement. You can heal the world. It's time for governance by grace. Welcome to Gracearchy with Jim Babka.
Thanks to a special sponsorship by the Foundation for Harmony and Prosperity, harmonyandprosperity.org, we sat down with Christina Dent, founder of End It for Good, the it being drug prohibition. In the first installment, episode 110, Christina explained how she discovered that addiction didn't fit in her pre-existing conservative Christian categories. The term rat park came up in the previous episode, but we got distracted from it. So here, Christina will come back to that subject, but mostly we're going to discuss how she was converted on the issue of drug prohibition. You'll discover here that there are real lessons to learn about how people change their minds.
I'd love it you talk about that moment when you recognized what was happening for us.
Yeah, you're right. My heart did change before my mind changed. And that heart change is what led me down a path of trying to learn. And it's so much of why I do a lot of storytelling now, is because I think it doesn't matter if we know harm is happening if we don't have a reason to care about it. That sounds kind of crass, but it just is true. If we don't connect to a problem, if we don't connect to the people that are impacted by something, it's just kind of numbers on a page. It's just we have a hard time really caring about it. So for me, that journey of caring started the day that I brought our foster son, Beckham, to his first visit with his mom, Joanne, at the local child welfare office. He had come to us straight from the hospital after his birth. His mom, Joanne, had been using drugs while she was pregnant. She wanted to be free from that, but she had been using for 20 years at this point. This was her first child. And she was not able to beat her addiction in the time that she was pregnant. And so when he was born, he was removed from her custody and put into foster care. And then she had the opportunity to prove that she could be a good mom to him. So he was brought to our home just not long after he was born. And a few days after that, I took him to his first visit with her. And I, at this point still, I really had no way of understanding addiction other than people who use drugs are bad people. People who struggle with addiction must be kind of a next level of bad person. And so I got to the child welfare office and pulled into the parking lot, opened my minivan door, got Beckham's car seat out, and turned around in the parking lot to walk inside. And there is this woman running across the parking lot towards me, crying. And she runs over, and I can already hear her talking as she is getting closer to us. But she's not talking to me. She's just talking to her son. This is Joanne. And she runs over and just starts kissing him and talking to him. And I stand there awkwardly unsure of what to do. I feel simultaneously this kind of shock of, wow, this is really open-hearted affection. And immediately this suspicion, which I look back now and I say it's the suspicion of not wanting to acknowledge something that does not fit with my current worldview. And I think I recognize that in myself all the time now, the sort of scanning for reasons not to listen, for reasons why I can just put this in the crazy bin or the I don't believe that bin or that's not true bin. But what I was experiencing is that disconnection between, wait a second, this is not how I thought someone who struggled with an addiction would respond to their child. And so she took her 1 hour of visitation time, and I came back and picked Beckham up from that tiny little visitation room. And she was just sitting on that couch, just cuddling her son, just spending that time with him. She was not on her phone scrolling or anything. She just was drinking in these few minutes that she had with her son. And she took him, I took him back to my house, and she went to inpatient drug treatment. And she would call me every day. We agreed that she could call once a day and get an update on him, and the treatment center agreed to allow her to do that. And she would want to know every detail I could tell her about him, anything that could help her feel connected to him. And then she would ask me to put her on speakerphone, and she would sing to him over the phone. I could be standing in my kitchen and hearing her sing "Jesus Loves Me" as this tiny little preemie baby is sitting in his little bouncy seat at my feet. And those experiences were just, it was like holy ground, seeing this level of love, this outpouring of love, this desire to connect with him in any way that she could, even though she had to let a stranger in on these experiences. And the more that I got to know her, the more I could not turn away from the reality that this is all true. She really does love him this much. She really does want to be there for him. And she's struggling with a meth addiction, one of the most highly stigmatized addictions that someone can struggle with. And that was a wrestling that began to show me what really was in my heart, which was all of this judgment and all of these preconceived ideas of what was really going on in her life, instead of allowing myself just to get to know her. And this is completely to Joanne's credit. I always say she is the hero of this story. She did not have to let me in. She could have held me at arm's length. Many parents do that because the relationship between a birth family and a foster family is very fraught. Not many of us would take kindly to and the state taking away our kids and putting them with some random stranger that they have decided is a better parent to your children than you are. It's a very difficult relationship, but she did not approach it that way. She just welcomed me into her life. She let me see who she is, and she is a mom like me. And that was the beginning of this tearing down of, I have radically misunderstood something because I have always thought of people like her as just bad people. And she's just someone like me. So what's really going on?
So initially though, and you kind of you touch on this in the book, when you're first seeing this, you're not approving it or able to connect it in your head, or you think that she's done something wrong. Did you, as you were going through this, did you have other people that you were bouncing this off of at the time, like your husband or whatever? You were like, geez, like, how is this possible?
No, it was all stuck in my head.
All in your head. Okay.
Yes. I don't even know if I would have known how to articulate even what the feeling was. It just was this like balling up of all of these experiences that I didn't really have a category for. And I just couldn't figure out what to do with them.
So when is the first time that you tell another human being, I'm having a problem here, I'm not sure I kind of know what to do or how to, like, something's not right?
I think I actually started reading before I told anyone else. So my brother that you met at Freedom Fest, he had read Johann Hari's book, Chasing the Scream, a couple of years before that. He was a state representative in Mississippi. And so he is a huge reader anyway, had read on all different kinds of policy and different things like that as part of this general life curiosity, but also if he's going to be voting on policy, to be well informed about what that is. So he had told me about that book. He had told me about Chasing the Scream. And I was like, I don't care. Why would I want to read a book about drugs? That doesn't impact me. And I am completely unconnected to that issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't care about it at all. And when I started to kind of realize I have radically misunderstood something. I'm not exactly sure what. This reminds me, I never got around to telling Rat Park. So Rat Park is also in that book, Chasing the Scream.
Mhm.
So I think I ended up going back to that. I remembered he had told me about that. I thought, okay, maybe that kind of holds some keys. And so I asked him about it and said, I'm interested in learning more. And so he lent me his copy of Chasing the Scream. And then I ended up reading it a second time because I found it was so good and I wanted to mark it up. And so I got my own copy.
Got your own copy.
Yes. But the thing that really resonated with me as I began that learning journey was Rat Park. So Dr. Bruce Alexander is a young psychologist, 50 years ago. And he sees these experiments that have been done with rats where you put them in these Skinner boxes, which are these tiny little boxes with nothing in them, where they would do these experiments. And you give a rat the opportunity to drink plain or to push a lever and get plain water or drug-laced water. And what they found is you put the rats in these boxes and they just keep pushing the lever for the drug-laced water. And they were widely publicized and said, look, this proves that these drugs are just, evil. If you get you take them one time and you can't stop taking them because look at what these rats do. So Dr. Alexander looked at those experiments and he said, well, that's strange because the environment that rat is in is totally opposite of anything where a rat would be happy. Rats are very social creatures. They want to be with other rats. They want to be active and doing things. And they're stuck in this box with nothing to do but press levers, one to get regular water, one to get drug-laced water. So he built, along with a couple of his colleagues, Rat Park on the floor of their lab at the university where they were teaching as well as practicing in these clinics. And they put sawdust on the floor and they got cans that the rats could run in and out of. And they got the wheels that they could run in and all kinds of things to play with. And they put lots of rats in Rat Park. So they had basically an environment where a rat would be happy on its own. And then they put, again, the plain water and the drug-laced water. And the rats could choose whatever they wanted to. They could push the lever however often they wanted to. And what they found is the rats almost never chose the drug-laced water. And even when they did, they never used it excessively. It was sort of the rat equivalent of recreational use, not addiction. And that was stunning to the world of science at the time when they publicized the results of this. It was not well received, which just goes to show, none of us like having things challenged that we thought we knew. The scientific and medical community was no different in that regard. They did not want that challenge. People had built their careers around this idea that drugs are the problem and drugs then we have to fight the drugs. And Dr. Alexander was saying, no, drugs are just the symptom of what else is happening in a person's life or in that rat's environment. And we have to start looking at the cage. We have to look at what is the context that person is living in, and why then they're making the choices that they are about substance use. And that just lit a light bulb for me. It helped me as someone who doesn't have a medical background or, I'm not a psychologist, to have a visual and to understand, yes, that does make sense. And that's when I began putting that together with the experiences of my own life, of realizing how things that happened to me a long time ago still impact me today. They may be smaller levels of impact. They may be greater levels of impact. So much of, even with the ACEs research, there is also a mirror research that has been done in more recent years around resiliency factors. And what they found is that even if you go through really, really traumatic things as a child, if you are surrounded by a supportive community where you have a place to process, where you are safe in that processing, you can overcome those without those lingering effects that they would have on you otherwise.
So there's a path to hope.
Yes. It is not some foregone conclusion of what's going to happen to you if you have things outside of your control that happen to you. And I think of my own life so much in that context. Even after losing my parents, and the way that I see that is it continues to be incredibly painful. I wish my parents were here. They never got to meet my husband and my children. I want them here very much. And yet losing people that you had a great relationship with is a very different thing from losing people who hurt you and damaged you and abused you and treated you terribly. Trauma, there are many different kinds of trauma, and it affects us in very different ways. And the things that I went through, I was surrounded by supportive community in my immediate family, in my church context. I had wonderful friends all through my childhood. And I look at that and say so much of the way that I was able to come through those things without um, moving to more harmful coping mechanisms, which doesn't mean I don't have unhealthy coping mechanisms, because I definitely do. But the more maybe potentially life damaging coping mechanisms that some people end up going to.
Yeah.
It's not because I am such a wonderful person or I was so much better at making healthy choices. It was that the community around me helped me to heal in ways that so many other people don't have.
You learned about these adverse childhood experiences mostly, or at least formatively, through observing Joanne dealing with Beckham. But there's one other thing that you do here that I'd like to unpack a tiny bit. You actually look at Joanne. Like, you talk about her. You've gotten to know her quite well. If you just called her the hero of of the story here, um, Joanne's childhood growing up doesn't sound like it's all that filled with trauma. And there's another part of this, kind of like, my evangelical upbringing, and I'm thinking about some of the other adults that were friends with my parents. And there was a time that I was growing up, I observed this many times, that certain people, certain kids were bad seeds, or their parents weren't really good parents somehow, right? And I'm kind of curious, like, is there some way that we can overprotect our children? Is this always the parents' fault when drug addiction shows up? Like, when you look at a story like Joanne's and some others that may be coming to your mind right now, what is the role of parents in protecting their children from trauma, and helping them steer and navigate so that they're ready to handle the trauma when it comes? And is it always the parents' fault?
I would say a resounding no, definitely not. And I think if there's anything that I have learned, it is to be very, very hesitant to sort of pin someone's experience on a particular thing. Um, because even for people, there are many people who experience addiction that they can't point to an A plus B equaled my addiction started.
Mhm.
I have there's a guy I know who struggled with opioid addiction for a number of years. And he says, I look back at my childhood and it was great. I had great parents. I had great, like, I don't know why this is that this has been a part of my life, but it has been a part of my life. And I think that's important. And I wanted to include Joanne's experience because of that. So, because I think um, I want to try to protect against that pendulum swing from, oh, we haven't had any knowledge of what's actually driving addiction. Oh, now everyone struggling with addiction must have the same level of experience. And there are some people who feel that way. Well, if you can't identify something, you just haven't quite gotten deep enough into your childhood to realize, or maybe you've just blocked it out. And I think I am never in favor of saying that I understand someone's life better than they do.
What's in common with all of those things is they're all performative. And we started off this portion of the show with Bill asking you a question about heart first, right? And the faith that we embrace in Jesus is not performative. It's not something we do. It's something he does, right? And it's something that starts in the heart. The head comes, is supposed to follow, but it's the heart that goes with it. I mean, there seems to me to be a pattern here that applies in both situations, right?
Yeah, I think very much in my own experience. And I think for other people as well. I just think it is so important that we are it comes back to this wanting to paint our own ideas onto other people's lives. That's not just true for people like me who weren't using drugs, but who were voting for the ways that we wanted drugs to be handled. It can also be true for someone who has found recovery, who is now convinced that everyone else needs to take the exact same path of recovery that they took. That is monumentally unhelpful to help people actually overcome the challenges in their life and the addictions that they're facing, because we don't know what's at the root cause of that. It might be that AA is super helpful for them, but the reality is that AA does not work for the vast majority of people who try it. So can we open the door to other types of recovery? Maybe medication will help them. Maybe talk therapy, maybe cognitive behavioral therapy, maybe psychedelic therapy. There's all kinds of different things that might help someone to overcome addiction. And when we try to paint, whether it's us trying to pinpoint what we think has caused a person's addiction, or whether it's trying to pigeonhole them into one particular way that they're going to get help and recover, it is not helpful for us to try to paint what we think has happened to a person or what we think they need to do onto their life. It doesn't work, and it is not helpful to not respect their own experiences and their own learning journey of what is it that has caused this. I think in my own life, I've had this tortured relationship with food for most of my life. Like it goes in and out of, being able to not eat the second or third piece of cake and then eating the second or third piece of cake. And here I am. I've been going to therapy for off and on for like 20 years.
Oh.
And I've talked about this with my therapist. I'm 20 years in. I have no idea. Why do I eat the third piece of cake sometimes? I don't know. I'm not going to feel good afterwards. It's definitely not going to be a wise choice. I am going to regret it. And yet, Christina, here I go. And I will still eat the third piece of cake sometimes. I don't know. And I think that is, we are so convinced that we just have to have everything boxed up nicely with that bow on top. We want it in our own lives, and we want it in other people's lives, and it makes us very uncomfortable.
There's something you're bringing up here, and I forgive me. I've noticed that a lot of church people are fat. I'm just going to say it. All right, it's a very common thing, and when they get together, they have carb fests, right? They're going to get together, and they're going to eat. And I used to go to a church where the pastor's one of his favorite jokes when he was trying to wrap up his sermon to say, we have to beat the Baptists to the steakhouse, right? There's this notion that you have to, eating is just completely acceptable. And so I look at people, and I know, for example, I know Mormons don't even drink, practicing Mormons don't even drink coffee, right? Because there's caffeine in it or whatever. But clearly this is a very, very similar behavior, but somehow or other it is, completely socially acceptable. Like I've not met anyone who is a drug warrior who thinks that that there's anything approaching close, even though it causes health problems. It means that you're going to die younger. Like there's a whole host of things that are attached to this behavior that are negative socially and relationally. Even your ability, as a Christian, your body's supposed to be a temple, right? There's not the same level of judgment here. But it does seem like there's some connection or relationship between these two things.
Yeah, I think it is the difference in socially acceptable harmful behavior and not. And now there are, I can eat the third piece of cake and I'm not putting my children at risk. I'm not spending, the last of the family savings on the cake because it's not that expensive.
Okay, well, maybe once.
So I think I don't want to equate the food addiction with the heroin addiction in terms of the impact.
No, but there's a lot of rhyming patterns there.
Yes. But the patterns of using something as a coping mechanism that is not healthy for you, that is not healthy for you, and yet you still engage in it anyway. And yet some of those behaviors are very socially acceptable and we don't even bat an eye at them. And some of them we have so incredibly stigmatized that we haven't just stigmatized the behavior, we've stigmatized the people. And that, I think, is the real one of the big tragedies of drug addiction, is the stigmatization of the people. And there's kind of a big movement to say, let's destigmatize addiction. And I think we need to be careful with that, because what we don't want to do is say addiction's no big deal. That's not what we want. We don't want to just
So
say,
we're not
hey,
looking for addiction pride campaigns.
right. No, we don't want to celebrate it. We don't want that kind of destigmatization. What we
I
want to
think
do
that's
is
actually a real fear.
separate.
I think it's a
Yes.
legitimate fear. We've seen that in other areas of culture, right? We've seen that with obesity. There's actually a group of people that celebrate that.
Yeah. So we
Um,
don't want that pendulum swing.
no.
But we do want to be able to separate the behavior from the person who is struggling and say, this behavior is really damaging and harmful. We want to help you as a person, because you are valuable, and you are worthy of being fought for. You're worthy to fight for yourself, to be able to live a life that is more fulfilling and meaningful. People who are in active addiction are not happy. They're dealing with immense shame. If you ask anyone who struggled with addiction, what was the kind of overarching feeling during that? It's immense shame over choices that they're making that they hate themselves for. And yet we continue to see that as the moral failing of that person, rather than as an outworking of them trying to cope with their life. And maybe it started as a coping with their life, and now they've got to keep using just to not go into withdrawal. There are lots of things and lots of trauma. And part of the story of Joanne is that her kind of recreational use as a young teenager, even though she grew up in a very sheltered home, for her, she wanted to kind of push against that and see what was outside of that and just fit in with the other kids. That early drug use exposed her to a lot of things, some that are not even in the book, that exposed her to a lot of trauma in that lifestyle. So it's this kind of snowball effect of, the more that a person is exposed to that kind of chaotic drug use and what can go on in those environments, now they've got even more negative experiences that they want to numb with the drugs. Unfortunately, that often exposes them to even more negative experiences. And then they get arrested, and then they lose their job. And then it's this snowball of harm that just keeps happening. And if we can respond in a way where people can get help much earlier on, without feeling like, if I acknowledge I have a problem, I'm acknowledging I'm a criminal, or I'm acknowledging I'm a terrible person. You cannot destigmatize something that is currently labeled criminal activity. Like you can't destigmatize criminal. And nor should we. We should be much more careful about who we label as a criminal, as someone engaging in criminal activity, because we don't want to destigmatize behavior that actually does harm other people.
Mm-mm.
And I think that's some of the negative part that has happened in some places that have tried to take a more understanding and compassionate approach to addiction, is that pendulum swing has happened where they have not been willing to hold the line on public order. And they've said kind of instead, hey, if they're struggling with addiction, just got to kind of let people do their thing. And I think that's where a good grasp of that people can make choices that affect them. And when their choices start to affect other people, like injecting drugs in front of a McDonald's, that's not okay. Now you're making a public choice. That's no longer just your personal choice anymore. And I think that's really important, that we not lose sight of that one person's rights does not allow them to impinge on everyone else's rights. We need to be very careful with that. Otherwise, we end up with scenarios where the public experience is just chaos. And we see that in some cities that have leaned what I would say is maybe a little too far in the direction of kind of just a hands-off approach, instead of a personal choice and public order are different things.